There's something magical about the movies that I just love, being transported to another world, another life. For me, it was a way to combine all my interests, music, visuals, and storytelling.
Roger Ebert said that a motion picture is an empathy-generating machine. It is the culmination of thousands of years of artists and artistry coming together to tell a single story. There's really, really nothing like it.
And as a medium, it's really powerful. It has the ability to leave us feeling hopeful or despairing about the world. It also has the ability to shape society.
They were the art form of the 20th century. They were the way we saw the world. Hollywood, they made a lot of very pro-American movies. And in fact, Hollywood invented America to the world in the old days.
But for some, that power isn't used for good.
Marvel's Doctor Strange accused of whitewashing to appease China.
In the original book, the zombie virus originates with a poor peasant boy in the rural countryside of China. It spreads through a black market organ trade. This whole plotline was surgically removed from the final script of the movie.
The new Barbie movie featuring a map of the South China Sea that shows China's ownership of disputed islands.
This is really designed for the eyes of the Chinese censors, and they're trying to kiss up to the Chinese Communist Party.
I believe that most of us, a large majority of us, got involved with China because of the opportunities and the fact that those opportunities also had a bigger calling, which was creating sort of this dynamic between the U.S. and China that was going to allow us to spread the aspirational quality of democracy into a communist country, maybe someday changing them over to a democracy like ours. But over time, all of us have been punched in the nose.
How far back does this go? When did this Hollywood-China relationship start? Why did it start? Is it really just about money? Are there other parts at stake?
All acts of genocide seek to remove from a community their stories. The very first thing.
It's been more than a decade we have not had a major studio put a movie into production with China as the villain.
It's so scary that they're able to pressure people to change their behavior from afar without no bullets. This is just money.
It's incredible to me to watch the power that they have.
They don't do this, of course, through direct control. They do it through their enormous economic leverage and the fear from studios on missing out on a market of 1.4 billion people.
What's at stake? The soul of the nation is at stake. Therefore, everything.
The nice thing about living here, as you can see, is you're right by the all-important airport. So if you're doing business in China, that always comes in handy. So I spend a lot of time on planes. It's nice when you're pretty close by. It's the shipping lane. So like up in my house, you can see the ships coming in from Shanghai's port, Hong Kong.
And they
all
come
come
here?
through this way, and you can see them all go across.
How did you get started with Hollywood especially?
It was just dumb luck. When I graduated school, the economy was not very good, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I read a book called Blue Highways that was written by a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, a guy named William Lee Seat Moon. And he talked about how he got in a van and just traveled across the country, and he visited different towns and cities and figured out what the heartbeat of America was. And I just thought that sounded super cool. That was like my Jack Kerouac type of like idea of, okay, well, I'm gonna do that and find a place to settle down, and then eventually, you know, somebody convinced me to come out to LA to visit, and I never left.
Wow.
And then next thing I know, I hear about the Hollywood business, and it was called the Wall Street of the 90s back then. I was like, wow, there's a lot of great opportunity. It sounded like whoever wanted to work the hardest could rise up. You know, it was very hard to get that entry-level job. A lot of that stuff was sort of given to the nephews of Steven Spielberg or whatever. But if you could get one of those, get that foot in the door, you know, the world was your oyster if you were willing to work hard for it. For me, I had no problem with working hard. I got a job as a temp at William Morris Agency, which is now Endeavor. Got promoted very quickly out of that and spent almost a decade there, and that's where I came across China for the first time.
China's rise has been something of a miracle. It is quite simply the most successful case of economic development in human history.
I didn't go to China for the first time until the early 2000s, and when I went over there, they had a joke that the national bird of China was the crane. When you get there and you throw on a hard hat pretty much everywhere you are, you realize the construction crane is everywhere you look in Beijing and Shanghai. When you see something like that, it was hard to sort of turn away from it as an opportunity. It looked really interesting to me. After the Olympics ended, the Chinese government said, we want to build a film industry. And they looked at various entities around the country and wondered who's going to help lead that crusade. And we raised our hand and we dove right into it.
So it sounds like you're a messenger role, almost like a diplomat. Did you see yourself kind of in that role?
Well, definitely a fixer, definitely a diplomat. This is what the Chinese government needs. I know that's too much for you, Hollywood, so let's figure out how we can get what their agenda is and make it work into the best sort of version of what this movie can be. Chinese bottles. If people have seen the movie Looper, it stars Bruce Willis, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Emily Blunt, and then we also had a Chinese actress named Summer Ching in it.
They use specialized assassins, like me, called loopers.
One of the things that's very difficult about a movie like that in China is that China does not allow time travel in a film. And the reason they don't like time travel in a movie is because you're telling a story about something that happened in the past and something that is happening in the future. And the Chinese government wants to control the way the past is portrayed, and the same thing for the future. They want to dictate where China's going, and they want to dictate what China's going to be viewed at as in the future. So any sort of time travel film, they don't like. The underlying thematic of the movie, as you're watching Joseph Gordon-Levitt in the present day, you know that at some point he wants to retire and he wants to move to his idea of utopia.
You're me in 30.
Joseph Gordon-Levitt, when he becomes Bruce Willis, in the original script, wanted to live in France. He wanted to marry not Summer Ching, but a French woman. So we had to think, okay, if we want to get this band type of concept into China, what do we do to brand integrate China's narrative, the narrative that the Chinese government wants in the film in order to get access to that huge market? So what we decided was we were going to essentially influence the filmmakers to change the future in the movie from France to China.
We know that you've been stashing afterwards.
So one of the things that we came up with during that was this funny exchange that would occur between a mobster that comes back into the present day, played by Jeff Daniels, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt. And in that scene, Joseph Gordon-Levitt is being asked by Jeff Daniels, where do you want to live? What do you want to do when you retire?
I'm going to France. You should go to China.
I'm going to France.
I'm from the future. You should go to China.
I'm going to France.
From the future, you want to move to China. When we tested it in front of an audience, they went crazy for that one line. And that line also had the Chinese government applauding. So we nailed both ends of that. We were on the cover of the New York Times, cover of the Wall Street Journal. This idea of creating a business out of Hollywood and getting access to that market was obviously what got us into it. But what it led to was something much bigger than that.
This show, China in Focus, started around the same time the virus broke out, and it's where we break stories of first-hand information from China. I think because we were the only show that was talking about it. No one in America was really talking about it until there were starting to be like 1 or 2 cases in the US. Then suddenly, you know, all the mainstream legacy media were talking about it too. But because people were reading about something happening and they wanted information, they found our show called China in Focus. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm your host, Tiffany Meyer. Questions are now being raised about how information about the coronavirus... Because we do have an underground network in China, right, that's able to get us first-hand information. So we were able to break a lot of the news. And so we were getting a lot of views. Back then we would get 1 or 2 million views per episode, so like per day. With the whole pandemic, right, you started having all sectors of society, whether that's government or just even, say, the average person on the street, start to realize, like, okay, why is it suddenly like this virus that seems to come out of Wuhan especially, why is this impacting me? How did it even get here, right? So suddenly, like, China was much more on the map for many more people.
The most consequential strategic competitor for the coming decades and the most serious challenge to U.S. national security. That's according to the Pentagon's new national defense strategy.
You know, with the pandemic, that suddenly this whole issue was really brought to light, and it was like, just how deep does the infiltration go? How many sectors? Is it just the government, or is it like everything? And that's when we saw the news about Top Gun.
The Taiwanese and the Japanese flag had been removed from Maverick's jacket. And there's a very clear reason why.
It's a big no-no for Chinese censors.
And that's what's so shocking about all of this, right? That an American icon would need to try and placate the Chinese regime. And that's not all. There seems to be more questions than answers at this point. What does it mean when such an influential cultural institution is taking its cues from the Chinese regime, which doesn't have our best interests in mind? How far back does this go, right? It's like, when did this Hollywood-China relationship start? Why did it start? Is it really just about money? Are there other parts at stake? Is it about cultural exchange? What really were the decisions that started this whole partnership?
DMG is celebrating its 19th year in operation. I've been working with the company since 1999. We're the #1 media buyer in China. We're constantly growing, so I will throw out there that we are consistently looking for MBAs that graduate with Mandarin language speaking skills. So if anybody wants to shoot me their resume, feel free. We can't hire fast enough. Well, it's interesting because as we were starting that process, Joe Biden, who was the vice president at the time, sat down with Xi Jinping. They created a new movie sort of structure of how Hollywood was going to get access to that market. They actually raised the amount of movies from 20 to, I think it was 32. And then on top of it, they raised the amount of box office that the studios get from China from 13.7% to 25%. These two future leaders of the two superpowers take such a vested interest in Hollywood. Before we got involved with Marvel, their largest hit was Iron Man 2 at the time. That made $20 million in the box office. When we made Iron Man 3 and got it into that box office a few years later, Iron Man 3 made $20 million just in its opening day, and it went on to make $125 million in that market. If you look to the last film that Marvel got in, which was the latest Avengers movie in, I believe, 2018, that film made $750 million just in the China market. So if you look at that crescendo, that exponential raise of where revenues and profits were going, everybody knew that that's what it was going to be someday. So if you could get access to the market early and continue to grow upon that, the world was limitless when it came to that market, and that's what everybody was chasing.
Something started in about 1994. The CCP allowed 10 films a year, and Hollywood didn't pay attention. But in 1996, Titanic was released, and it made almost $70 million. This caught Hollywood's attention. Titanic, I think, also caught the CCP's attention. And that's really was the birth of that relationship.
If we look at Jiang Zemin, with him it's quite interesting because he saw Titanic and he was extremely impressed with it because it's very emotional. And he was just blown away by the power that has. And so he required the party's most powerful members, the 7 members of the Politburo, he required them to watch the film. And he told them, we should never think that we are the only ones who know how to work on people's ideology.
And so he really recognized the impact that emotion can have on people's ideology and thinking.
Chinese influence was playing into what we see in US films. It's not a one-off, it's not an occasional thing, it happens a lot.
The influence started in 1997 with Red Corner, Kundun, and 7 Years in Tibet.
The Red Corner is a 1997 film that Richard Gere starred in, and he plays a character, an entertainment lawyer called Jack Moore. And his job is to go to Beijing and try and broker this satellite deal. And while he's there, he gets basically framed and suspected of committing a murder. And so he gets a state-appointed lawyer who tells him you should just plead guilty or else you could basically be executed.
And unlike in your country, Mr. Moore, sentences are carried out within a week. You will be shot and the cost of the bullet will be billed to your family.
China's Ministry of Radio, Film and Television, which is one of the government apparatuses, was telling them, no cooperation between any of the studios that were behind this movie. China didn't want to work with them. There's a lot of money involved, just cut them off. So that also really impacted Richard Gere's career in Hollywood.
Scorsese had this film in the mid-90s. It was on the Dalai Lama.
Back to lead us.
And they basically shelved the film. It was a Scorsese film, and the studio basically tripped it and pushed it in the corner and tried to pretend it never happened.
Religion is poison. We accept no conditions from the Chinese.
You can't even watch it on DirecTV. You can't download it. It's not on Netflix. It's not on Amazon. They tried to do the same thing with 7 Years in Tibet.
"7 Years in Tibet" is actually based on a true story about the young Dalai Lama.
May they be joyfully reunited with their relatives.
This was when he's super young. It's a story about him and an Austrian mountaineer back in the day. So a French director heard this story and was like, wow, it's incredible. I want to make a movie out of it. And so he did. And it starred Brad Pitt and all this. And so this also came out in 1997. But after it came out, the Chinese Communist Party was really unhappy with it. They're like, you made our military officers look really brutal and you portrayed the Dalai Lama in too much of a positive light, because the Chinese Communist Party had taken over Tibet in the 1950s. So they're quite sensitive about how that's portrayed. So they banned basically everyone involved. Sony Studios wasn't allowed to operate in China for decades. And Brad Pitt, who was also quite young at the time in that movie, wasn't allowed back into China till 2014 and 2016. So that's like how long the repercussions were, just for, trying to do something that was based on a true story.
It's striking to me, and you have to ask yourself why. And you know why. It's the long shadow of the CCP.
And that was the shot heard around the world, which was, Hollywood, you can't just make the stories that you want to make and tell them on the big screen without thinking about China first.
That was a warning to all other studios in the West, being like, if you do something we don't like, you're gonna have to suffer the consequences.